I am Kevin Goldsmith. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Untitled in London. For those of you who don't know us, we help people prove they are who they say they are on the internet and reduce fraud and things like identity stealing and things like that. This talk today is about 4 things, and that's to kick us off for this pretty amazing day. I'm really excited to be here. I've been talking to Yale for a while, and I'm glad I was finally able to make it. So this talk is about 4 things, as I said: organization, architecture, autonomy, and accountability. And these things are all tied together. These things are all interrelated. So to start us off, some principles. These are the principles that are going to underlie everything else I talk about here today. So first of all, and this should not be very controversial, data is more important than opinion. Okay? I like facts. I like knowledge. I like knowing the truth, not having opinions about it. You would think this should be fairly uncontroversial. If you've ever sat in a room with a product manager and they explain to you that I know this is what the customers want. I know our customers, I know our product, this is what they want. And then you say, how do you know this is what they want? And they say, I just know. I hate that conversation. So that's a core principle, is data is more important than opinion, go from facts. There's a great quote from Arthur Conan Doyle talking about Sherlock Holmes, right? I never guess. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. You start with the facts and then you go from there. The second thing, the second principle, which may be a little bit more controversial depending on some of you, would be this one. The speed of iteration is more important than the quality of iteration. This doesn't mean I don't believe in quality and in having fewer bugs, but what it does mean is that I am willing to accept a level of less quality if I can get value to customers sooner, because I want to learn faster. So it is always about setting a minimum level of quality so that you are bringing more value to customers than you're taking away, and that you can learn from it. This tends to be a little bit more controversial, but this is something that I have learned over many years in this industry. Now, these 2 things are also interrelated, right? Because if you're moving fast, and that's really the goal, how do we bring value to customers quicker? If you're moving fast without data, that means you're not learning. So if you think about it running through a forest, covering your eyes, you can go very fast for a very short period of time, right? Till you hit a tree or trip over or something, right? And the opposite, the corollary is also true. If you're walking through a forest and you're looking for every branch or every possible obstacle, you will move very, very slowly. And that's also not a way to be successful. You need to be able to do both. Now, these principles and these ways of thinking come into the way that companies that I work for and companies that I lead, how we develop our products. For those of you who are used to Lean and the build, measure, learn loop, or Agile's build, measure, learn loop, this is sort of the version that I like to use. So it starts with data, right? Data's at the top. We start with our facts. Our facts inform our vision, our product vision, or our technology strategy, or the thing where we're looking out into the future. This is where we're going to go. That vision guides experiments, right? Because we don't know that where we think we want to go is the right place to go. We have to test it. We have hypotheses that we need to validate. Very familiar to those of you who've done lean startup type things. Those experiments, or those experiments give us more learning. It's another way of saying data. Data's kind of in here twice. Those experiments teach us, is this actually the right thing? Do we have the right idea here? Are we going in the right direction? That's what drives the product forward. So we are learning, we are applying those learnings, and then we are moving the product forward. And that product in the market with customers gives us more data, and we start the loop again. And everything I'm trying to do and everything I'm talking about today is making this loop go faster, go as fast as possible. Because if I can do this, if you're in a company competing with Onfido, and I can do this twice as fast as you can, or you're not even doing this at all, I promise you we're going to beat you in the market. And I've seen this demonstrated now I've been doing this now for several years in multiple companies, and I've seen this work very well in every one of those companies. So how do you get this speed? One of the things I've found, and as Yael mentioned, I was at Spotify, and we certainly did this, but actually I started doing this before Spotify. That's one of the reasons I went to Spotify, is they did this much better, which was building autonomous teams, right? Autonomous teams go faster, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining it. Autonomous teams was also a little bit more controversial a few years ago. Now folks are more comfortable with it, but I see it done wrong so many times when I visit other companies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it really means to build an autonomous team. And part of the reason they go faster is they're learning faster. Let's go to the definition of autonomy from Merriam-Webster. So specifically, having the freedom to act independently. The two words here being freedom and independently. An autonomous team is fully empowered, and we say the word empower a lot, but we don't talk about resourcing enough. And that's where I see a lot of companies go wrong. They'll say, no, we give our teams decision making, they can make their own decisions, and that's great, but then we don't give them enough people to actually implement those decisions. So the team isn't really autonomous. If you have a company that says, oh, we have autonomous teams, but we have a shared data analytics team, or we have a shared UX team, so if I need design in order to implement a decision and I have to go negotiate with some other team in order to do it, then I'm not autonomous. If I need another team's permission to deploy, I'm not autonomous. If I need another team's, if I don't have a full-time, I have a mobile developer, but I don't have a full-time mobile developer on a team, they're shared with another team, now these two teams have to negotiate priorities, they're not autonomous. So this resourcing, you can say your team is empowered, but if the team isn't resourced to actually implement their decisions without coordinating with some other team, then they're not fully autonomous. And that's important because autonomous teams, you want them generating those experiments. Those experiments in that loop, those need to be coming from the teams, not from the C-level folks. And I also want to talk, because this I find gets confused a lot as well. When we talk about autonomous teams, we're talking about autonomous teams, not autonomous individuals. I've been in companies where we were moving into an autonomous team model, and developers thought, well, this means I get to do what I want, and you absolutely do not. Software development is a team sport now. When I started as a software developer 1,000 years ago, I would go and sit in my cubicle, and I would code for 8 hours, and then I would go home by myself. And that's how we wrote software. Everyone around me did the exact same thing. That's not how we write software anymore. We write it as a team. And this is important also because when we come to this idea around accountability, individuals on a team are accountable to each other, right? If I am an individual writing software and I have no one to answer to, right? I'm an autonomous individual, I don't have any accountability to anyone. If I'm part of a team, I have an accountability to the team. And the team makes sure that we're doing the right thing collectively. I have a level of establishing good practice there. Let's talk a little bit about the requirements of autonomy. So in order to build true autonomy in your organization, you need a few things. You need communication. Now that's a sort of obvious thing to say, well, we need communication. But it's important because in a traditional kind of command and control structure where somebody like me is saying, this is what we're going to do and this is when I expect it done from every team in my organization, you need to know exactly what I need you to know because you're doing what I think you need to do. In an autonomous team, you're making your decisions, everyone's making their decisions. How do you know what everyone else is doing? So you can't rely on somebody like me to spread information around the organization. You have to communicate with each other. So teams have to talk to each other. And folks like me who are paying attention to what's going on, we need to see that as well. So there's a lot more requirements for teams to be very visible and transparent and vocal about what they're doing and what they're thinking about doing. You need context, and I'm differentiating context from communication. So my job as a CTO, I'm looking across the company, right? My peers are the executive team. I am talking to them, I'm seeing different parts of the business, I'm talking to other companies, I'm talking to customers, I'm looking at what's going on in the industry. My job is to collect all this information and make sure every one of my teams has it. They need that context. They're going to take this stuff that I'm looking at, they're going to marry it with the problems that they're solving, their local context, and they're going to make better decisions. They need that information to make good decisions. And that's part of my job, is giving them the context they need to make good choices. Similarly, transparency. So if me or the VPs that work for me or the directors that work for them, if any one of us or anybody in the organization is hoarding information or trying to control information, well, that's going to lead to bad decisions, and teams are going to make bad choices. You need to be transparent. You need to default to transparent. You need to provide as much information as possible so that people have it and can make good choices. And the final thing, and this is actually, I think, in a lot of ways the hardest, trust. You need trust in your organization. And when I say trust, I mean trust team to team, but I also mean trust from leadership. So if you are working in a company and the company leaders say, we're an autonomous organization and I need to see everything you're doing all the time and you need to run it by me before you make a decision, then the leadership isn't trusting. I have to trust that if I give the right information to all the teams, I'm transparent, I give context, that those teams are making good choices, and I have to trust that they're good choices because they don't need to tell me about them. It's my job to find out about them afterwards. If I have to be part of the decision process, let's say I have to approve every decision. I'm in Israel today. My teams are in London and Lisbon. So if they need me to make a decision and I'm here, that means no decisions get made. That's not a good way to work, especially if you're trying to go faster. And trust is also important because trust is crucial. And where I see a lot of leaders, and possibly leaders in your company or you if you're a leader, get stuck up on this is, they say, well, if I let the teams make the choices, well, how do I know they're making good choices? And I ask them, well, do you hire smart people? Oh, yeah, so we hire the smartest people in our company. We are so smart. Well, then, if you give them the information they need to make a good decision, don't you think they'll make a good decision? Well, I don't know. I don't know if they'll make a good decision. Well, for me, if you can't hire people you can trust to make good decisions, then it's really you're not good at hiring people, and you should probably do something else. So if we're all good at trying to hire the best people we can, and we give them the information they need to make good decisions, we have to trust that they're going to make them. So by giving teams context and trust and reducing their dependencies on other teams, they can make decisions on their own. And they can execute on their decisions. They can become autonomous. That's the things that I look for. This is the requirements of autonomy and giving autonomy into your teams. So let's say now you have autonomy, right? Well, our teams are autonomous. A lot of people think that's going to lead to anarchy, right? Because now teams can make their own decisions. And so how do you know that one team doesn't decide, even though we're a company that makes accounting software, we really want to make games, so we're going to make games now, right? How do you prevent those kinds of things from happening? In practicality, especially if you do it even slightly right, that isn't the case at all. So if you think about a lot of teams and each can go in any direction they want, you can have this kind of crazy kinetic effect. But realistically, it isn't really like that. It's everybody's going in generally the same direction. Not exactly the same direction, but generally the same direction. So if you're going, mostly everybody's going northeast, some are going northeast, some are going kind of more north, some are going further east, but they're all going in the generally right way. And how do you make that happen when each of these teams can make their own choices? It's actually very simple. You give them a North Star so they know where we should be going as a company. That's achieved very easily through things like product vision. Agile, lean, doesn't mean you don't have product vision and you don't have technical strategy and you don't have these things that other companies do. It just means you give people more control, teams more control about how they achieve them. So the product vision helps orient the teams and align them. Being very visible about your company goals. So people know, this year we are going to grow this market by 10%. Here's all the reasons why we want to grow this market. This is why it's important to us as a company. That means that a team can say, oh, well, in order to help grow this market, we should do the following things. That isn't me telling this team, you need to do these things to grow this market. It's that team making the choices, but they know the goal is to grow the market. Similarly, if we are all going in the generally same direction, how do we make sure we get there together and we get there in a good way? This is where you have things like guardrails that help teams make sure that they're doing the right things. One of them is key performance indicators, KPIs. Have folks heard of KPIs or key performance indicators? Okay, a reasonable amount. It's essentially a set of metrics that the team can use to judge, a set of objective metrics, data. Remember, data is more important than opinion. So objective, not subjective metrics. So normally in a company I'm in, a team will come up with their own KPIs. We are going to own this product metric, right? We are going to own activation. And they'll negotiate that with other teams and they'll negotiate that with the senior leadership. And if they can own that, well then now they know if we are owning conversion or we are owning activation, if this number is going up, then we're doing the right thing. If the number is not going up, we need to think about what we're doing. And that gives them a nice, clear metric that they can drive. And it also gives visibility into what the team's doing from other teams. Best practices, this is something we all have at our companies. And I'm differentiating best practices from sort of like processes and procedures and formalized things you might have for governance that teams really have very little control over. These are the things that actually teams do have control over and have a choice in, but are good guides for them. And finally, leadership. In an autonomous organizations still need leaders. It's not that they don't need leadership or it's a managerless culture. You can do it, I know companies try and do it managerless, that may work, but in the companies that I've been in, leadership still has a responsibility, and the responsibility is to make sure the teams that everyone understands kind of the company direction, that bringing context into the teams is an important thing. And also, honestly, you still need somebody kind of paying attention. Hey, you own this KPI is going in the wrong direction. What are you doing to change that? And asking those hard questions. The difference is leadership isn't pushing decisions down. Leadership is supporting and making sure folks are doing the right thing after the fact instead of before. So if you think about it, the way it'll work in this kind of leadered autonomous organization, my job as a part of the executive team is to say, this is what we need to do as a company, and this is why we need to do it, because you need that context. We need to grow this market by 10%. Or expand into this market. We believe that we need to go in this market for the following 10 reasons. It'll lead us into more business, obviously, but it'll help set up this other market or whatever. And for a team in my organization today, like we do this ID verification and validation and fraud prevention, that team may say, oh, okay, well, if we're growing in that market, we don't have all the documents support that we need for that market. We should go and do that. That isn't me telling the team, you need to go get all these documents. That's this team saying, we're responsible for documents. If we're going to grow in this market, we know that we should make this decision. And then they can make that decision autonomously. Now this is a Agile conference, but it's also a technology conference. It's important to actually talk about, there are software architectures, I think, that are very supportive of autonomous teams, and learn this through trial and error. Obviously, microservices, yay. Microservices are really helpful, and when I say microservices, I don't mean microservices. I mean any small composable pieces that a team can own completely. So microservices, functions or lambdas, libraries, independent apps, whatever, anything that a team can own wholly, right? So just because the products I tend to build, microservices tend to be more prominent than those other things, but that's the idea. And why does this work better? It's because of something called Conway's Law. So I've got a talk later today that I'll also talk about Conway's Law. And for those who hasn't or who has heard of Conway's Law, okay, this is a paper written by Melvin Conway in 1968, over 50 years ago. Believe it or not, there was computer architects 50 years ago. And he wrote, "How Do Committees Invent?" Fred Brooks, in the Mythical Man Month, coined the term Conway's Law, talking about this paper. And the important part of it, this idea, is organizations and the communication structures within these organizations. Specifically, he was talking about software architecture organizations. They build software that mimics the communication patterns of the organization, right? In mathematical terms, there's a homomorphism in the map of your software architecture and the map of your organizational structure. So if you think about autonomous teams, these little teams that are independent and have freedom to make decisions, a software architecture that maps very well to this is microservices or small composable pieces of software that the team can own wholly, because then they don't have to negotiate with other teams about deployment or software architecture or things like that. For those of you that wonder, they actually did prove, Conway's Law was originally written just as an article, like essentially an opinion piece blog post published in a magazine, really. It wasn't a scientific thing, but it has remained so true and so obvious over 50 years that a team from Harvard Business School actually went and tried to prove it and found strong evidence that it actually happens, that the structure of your organization will be reflected in the software architecture you have. So another reason why, so related to this, why microservices enable autonomy, it decouples delivery schedules, right? Especially if you're a back-end service, I can deploy as much as I want, whenever I want. I don't have to wait for a deployment train to deploy our software, right? So I don't have to negotiate with other teams or lock down onto some artificial schedule that doesn't have meaning for what we're doing. Even at Spotify, we had autonomous teams. We deployed our mobile apps on a regular schedule, but each team controlled when things went into it. So we tried to separate that as much as possible from an independent team, and we also tried to release as often as possible, so there wasn't as much of a delay from when a team would build something to when it would show up in the product. It also lets you kind of break this thing. So if one team is doing more data-driven stuff and they want to use Python and everyone else is using Java, they can. And that's actually very important, because the team needs to be able to make these kinds of choices. And if there's a lot of artificial constraints on what they do, then they're not truly autonomous. Microservices also enable accountability, which is important, especially for autonomous teams. The team owns the deliverables. I've said that a couple times now, but that's an important part. The team is wholly responsible for their deliverables. If I am an autonomous team working on a big monolith, right, and there's an issue, I can't be sure that the issue is my fault, right? And I don't necessarily need to take ownership of it, me as a team. So in a microservices environment, the autonomous team is responsible and owns their deliverables. It also, as I said a couple times, it lets us deliver as fast as we want. We want to go through this loop as fast as possible. That means bringing things to customers, experiments, or features as fast as you can. It gives us the ability to experiment independently of other teams. Because we are responsible for our deliverables, we can run our experiments in ours without affecting other teams. And it gives us operational responsibility, which is good from a DevOps perspective as well. Speaking of DevOps, for those of you who work in a microservices environment or work in a small composable pieces kind of platform, this is a lot different from the way we used to work. When I was at Adobe, I ran a product group at Adobe building essentially a consumer photography solution. So we had a monolith, right? So I had functional teams there. And that was super easy to deploy, right? And scaled pretty well, right? Because we would just copy the binary to the servers, boom, and then fix our load balancing. So that worked great. I had a very, very small kind of DevOps function in my organization relative to the size of the organization. I went to Spotify from there, where we had in my team, on the order of hundreds of services. And one of the things that really surprised me when I went to Spotify was that the size of the sort of DevOps function was much, much bigger than my team. My team was responsible for building the product. Like, we built the mobile product, we built the desktop product, we built the web product, we did all the ingestion, all the streaming, all the catalog, right? So you would think that's kind of the biggest part of the Spotify app. The DevOps team was nearly twice the size of my team. But there was no way that we could have done what we did without that function and that function at that size. So you needed a lot of tooling in order to make this work. And this is where we get into the role of DevOps in this kind of environment. Autonomous teams and building in a microservice or composable pieces environment need a strong DevOps function to work. Like, that is the glue that holds the whole thing together. So if we go back to this slide, how do we get there together? So I talked about KPIs, best practices, and leadership. A lot of this is actually coming from DevOps, right? DevOps makes sure that we are measuring our KPIs in a consistent way. Not DevOps isn't setting the KPIs, but I need to make sure, me as a leader, that two different teams are measuring their KPIs in a similar way. Because if not, then I don't have any kind of basis for understanding what the truth is. So I need to make sure there's consistency there. That comes from DevOps. These best practices, these come from DevOps. These are codified by DevOps. How do we do networking? How do we do routing? That's a DevOps decision. How do services log so that we can parse their logs? That's a DevOps decision. These are things that are codified and owned by the DevOps team. And leadership, looking across the organization, identifying teams that may be making a strange decision that you want to follow up on, that also comes from DevOps. So in my kind of world and in the organizations that I've built over the last, many years, that this role is really critical. The DevOps teams are really focused on supporting everything else to make sure it's possible by building tools and making sure that those teams can deliver value as quickly as possible. And this last point, creating the path of least resistance, is actually something I want to talk a little bit more about, because it's a way of working that I found has worked really, really well in an autonomous team environment. And again, one of these things that helps establish that we all go in generally the right direction. It's something I call being opinionated. So organizations that I've worked in, organizations I've led, we are opinionated. We don't have rules as much as possible. You have to have some always, but I try and have as few as possible. Beyond the rules and the requirements are opinions. These are the things we believe. So for example, on Fido, or a couple companies ago, I was CTO at a company called Avo. At these companies, we're Ruby houses, right? So Unfido is a Ruby house. We build software in Ruby. So that's our very strong opinion, okay? However, not long ago, a team had a problem and said, you know, Ruby's not actually the best solution for this problem. Ruby's actually a bad solution for this problem. Elixir might be a better way to solve this problem. Okay, well, we have an opinion that we're a Ruby house, but we don't. It's not a requirement. So okay, sure. If you think this is a better solution in Elixir, all right, let's try it in Elixir. And it turns out Elixir was a better solution for that problem. And then they had another problem that was also an Elixir problem. And then another team had a thing, and they said, hey, this isn't working well in Ruby. How's it working for you in Elixir? Oh, it's working better. And then that team started using Elixir, and now Onfido is an Elixir and Ruby house, and this is our strong opinion. And somebody may say, you know what, I think this needs to be written in Rust. Okay, well, our opinion is that we're an Elixir Ruby house, but it's not a rule, so try it in Rust. Oh, you know what, we tried it in Rust, doesn't work. Okay, that's fine. All right, so what it means is we try and make the things that we are opinionated about easy. So the job of coming back to DevOps, the job is to make sure that Ruby is easy to write. We make it so every company I've been in, whatever our strong opinion is, I want a developer on a team to be able to take a template and add a little bit of business logic and deploy into production in less than an hour, right? That's always the goal. So that means in order to deploy, you need to have monitoring, you need to have alerting, you need to have unit tests, you need to have good logging, all that you need to be connected into all of our routing and all those kinds of things. You need to have a good API. I want all that because that's just boilerplate. I want that made super easy. Now, if you want to do something that we don't have a strong opinion about, say Rust, if we're a Ruby house, you want to do Rust, you can do Rust. However, we're not making that easy for you. You actually have to prove that it's worth the effort. So that means if you want to write a Rust service instead, that's fine, but you are going to have to make it work with our logging and our alerting and monitoring and testing. That's going to be on you, which means, again, because you're part of a team, you have to convince your team that it's worth you taking the time to do all this work. But once that work is done, and it becomes now, let's say Rust does become a valuable thing, and other teams start using Rust, well, eventually that becomes part of the strong opinion that we have, and now the DevOps team makes sure that it's easy to do it. This is the way we let new ideas in, especially around technology. One of the things I see often at companies, and maybe you have it at your companies or your friends' companies, you make a decision early on. We are going to use Java, and we're going to do Java in this way. And you go forward, but this is a rule. All new software is written in Java, right? Because that makes lots of things easier. Meanwhile, the rest of the industry, which you might be right on at the beginning, the rest of the industry starts going off this direction. But you're really going this direction because this is the way you do things. And a few years down the road, you find, wow, the rest of the industry is over here. We're over here now. I think we're going to have to hire somebody like some consulting firm to come in and spend a year with us to try and get us now here because we can't do anything anymore. We can't hire developers or we can't deploy anymore because the way we do things is now so out of step with the rest of the industry. So being this opinionated instead of having rules lets the new technology in and lets you kind of keep track to the best practices in the industry a little bit better, in my experience. And as I said, when the new becomes commonplace, when the new language or the new architecture pattern becomes commonplace, you make that easy. So this is where I said, like, we used to do microservices, now we do functions and microservices. Soon we'll be doing something else, quantum computing or whatever. So just to bring it back around and kind of reiterate on what I've talked about before. So we talked about 4 things today: organization, architecture, autonomy, and accountability. Again, data better than opinion. Speed of iteration more important than quality of iteration. Autonomous teams, and I've done this now at 1, 2, 4 or 5 companies. I've built autonomous team structures, each different. Not Spotify. I did Spotify. I've done other things, but always this autonomous team model, and that's because they iterate faster. For teams to be autonomous, they need context, they need direction, and they need guardrails to make sure they're not going too far in a bad direction themselves. So you don't need people like me kind of watching them all the time. They need this accountability, having objective metrics that they can measure and that are visible helps them measure their performance and make sure they know that they're going in the right direction. In order to support autonomous teams, you need architecture, microservices, composable functions, whatever supports this pattern. And DevOps teams make that possible. So DevOps is what helps you glue this all together. Toda.